Leading off our discussion tonight, Chuck Rosenberg, former senior FBI official, former U.S. attorney, and a former counsel to Robert Mueller at the FBI. He now hosts the MSNBC podcast, The Oath. Also joining us tonight, Joyce Vance, former U.S. attorney for the Northern District of Alabama and an MSNBC legal analyst. And Evan McMullin, he's former CIA operative and a former independent presidential candidate. He is the co-founder of Stand Up Republic. And Chuck Rosenberg, I want to start with you, and I actually want to start with that moment, which would have been ignorable in news accounts anyway, and as we know is routine, where the U.S. attorney turns to the FBI and thanks them for their work that got them this far. In today's atmosphere, with a president of the United States attacking the FBI relentlessly as he has done, that moment stood out in a way that really it shouldn't have. But for me, it really did stand out.
I think that's fair, Lawrence. You know, Joyce and I, as former U.S. attorneys, have both done that. We've thanked leaders of the FBI and the ATF and the DEA for cases that they brought. But you're right. The FBI has been under attack. And so for a United States attorney to stand up and publicly thank them, and thank them profusely, is not only the right thing to do, but also helps send a message that these men and women in the FBI and the U.S. attorney's offices are not political. By and large, they are career investigators and prosecutors doing hard work day in and day out. And so the thank you was both appropriate and I think needed.
And Joyce, what does this mean for these defendants now as possible witnesses to Congress?
It's an interesting question, Lawrence. I think the U.S. Attorney's Office in the Southern District will want the first bite at these defendants as possible witnesses. When you engage in this sort of an indictment and bring these sorts of defendants in and say that investigation is ongoing, it often means that you have an interest in whether or not these defendants have any cooperation to offer that could lead to prosecution of bigger fish. So that, I think, is the first order of business. It's a little bit unusual to have witnesses and defendants in federal cases whose appearance is wanted in front of Congress. But I think it's a safe bet that if Congress issues subpoenas, that the U.S. Marshal, the U.S. Attorney, the Justice Department will work with Congress to figure out a suitable and appropriate way for Congress to acquire the testimony that it's lawfully entitled to.
But Joyce, aren't they very likely to just take the Fifth Amendment now on every question?
You know, that's a possibility with every witness, and certainly once you've been indicted, you know, you can't take the Fifth Amendment on every question, only on the questions where your answers would tend to inculpate you to make you guilty of a crime or offer evidence of that. But it's likely that there would be a lot of that going on unless some sort of a deal is worked out. And frankly, if these defendants are smart and if they receive the benefit of competent counsel, they will quickly begin to think about the fact that their best option, if they don't want to spend many years in prison, would be to think about areas where they could cooperate and what truthful and complete testimony they might be able to offer to prosecutors in the Southern District.
Evan McMullin, let's pull back and look at what this story is in its basic shape. Close advisor to the president, Rudy Giuliani, on a special mission for the president, Rudy Giuliani, engages these two guys to help him out. And tonight, those two people who were invited to the White House for dinner with the president because they were so valuable to Rudy Giuliani and the president on the Ukraine mission, those two people are indicted and arrested.
That's right. I think we have a lot more, obviously, to learn about these guys. But let's just keep in mind, you know, what we know already. We know that they were funneling money that came from a Ukrainian with Russian roots and Russian ties. So could that be Russian money, actually? So who were these guys to have those contacts? That's interesting. They were in the middle of an effort to get the U.S. ambassador at the time fired and replaced. They were, helping Giuliani pursue foreign election assistance for the president. They were involved in funneling illegal money, as they were indicted on today, to U.S. politicians. I mean, I really, these guys were a nexus of activity, and I believe there's a lot more to learn about them, a lot more to learn about their activities. We know they spend time in the White House and with the president, as you showed, obviously with Giuliani. But who else knew about them? What other contacts did they have in Ukraine, in Russia, in the United States, in the administration? Guys like this, especially guys who are this sloppy, which I got to tell you, they seem quite sloppy. They leave a lot of trail, a lot of crumbs, a lot of evidence along the way of their wrongdoing. And I think there's a lot more to learn here about these guys and about those who were involved in the administration with them.
Chuck Rosenberg, reports indicate that Attorney General William Barr was kept posted on this investigation. So he knew the investigation was going on. He apparently knew that the indictment was being issued. He knew the arrests were going to be made. There are people who've been watching Attorney General Barr, people out there in the country, in our audience, who I think regard him as a protector of the president in all things. If William Barr wanted to protect the president from any effect of this investigation, could he have shut it down?
That would be very, very hard to do. By design, Lawrence, the U.S. Attorney's Office, the U.S. Attorney community has an extraordinarily thin political layer. For instance, in the Southern District of New York, the only political appointee is the U.S. Attorney, Jeffrey Berman. Everyone else in that office, everyone else is a career prosecutor, a career support person, a career analyst, and the like. And so the notion that an attorney general could shut down a valid and predicated investigation in a U.S. attorney's office seems to me to be pretty far-fetched. By the way, one minor point that I'd like to make, as U.S. attorneys, and again, Joyce and I had this experience, we have an obligation to file reports with the Department of Justice, with Maine Justice, when we're bringing a significant case. They're called urgent reports, and they go to the Deputy Attorney General and often to the Attorney General. So there's nothing inherently nefarious about notifying an Attorney General. It would only be, of course, improper if he or she did something to thwart or undermine the case. But again, I think that's really hard to do.
And Joyce, is it when Chuck says it's really hard to do, just walk us through it. If an attorney general did try to block an investigation like this, and I'm not suggesting that William Barr would do that, but just for the audience, I just want to walk through what would happen. Would a U.S. attorney resign, for example? Would a career prosecutor go to the Inspector General of the Justice Department? What might happen?
You know, prosecutors tend to be people who understand the department's traditions and its practices very well. And prosecutors and the agents that they work with feel very strongly about their cases, especially when they're ready for indictment and especially when there's something as important as protecting the integrity of American elections. So I would expect that if something like this were to happen, and I think as Chuck says, there's no indication that it happened here, every indication to the contrary, and the urgent report would have been transmitted to Washington within something like 72 hours of filing an important case like this in any event. But prosecutors and agents would have begun to show concern to their supervisors if they were told the case couldn't move forward. And I think ultimately you would see protests at every level in a U.S. attorney's office, with everyone from line prosecutors and line agents on all the way up to the U.S. attorney, who, as Chuck points out, is the only political appointee in every U.S. attorney's office. You would see those resignations in protest if they were told they couldn't move forward with a case that they had appropriate evidence on and reason to believe that they could obtain and sustain a conviction in.
And Evan McMullin, I referred in my opening that the movie writes itself, but in some ways it's a bad movie, meaning the scene right before the airport is these two guys having lunch with Rudy Giuliani, which is an okay scene, but it's at the Trump Hotel in Washington, which is just too on the nose. That's the bad movie version of that scene. They would have that lunch in some other location and some more, they'd make a more discreet choice in the good movie. It feels like we're watching the bad movie of this stuff.
Yeah, well, I think what we're seeing here, Lawrence, is just the brazenness of the administration and its supporters, its allies, to break the law in pursuit of illegal election help and other corrupt activities. I mean, the idea that they would sort of be involved in these kinds of activities and sort of meet openly and sort of demonstrate all their connections on social media openly while engaged in these kinds of activities. I mean, it is tremendously sloppy, but it also, I think, more importantly, shows that they believe they're operating in an environment, or they probably have a different idea now, but they believe they were operating in an environment where they didn't have to be careful, where they could engage in this kind of activity and they were going to be protected. Why? We should ask why, and we should want to know why they felt so sure of that.
Well, when the president of the United States is on your team, you might feel pretty
right.
protected.
That's what I'm getting at.
Thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on the button below for more from The Last Word and the rest of MSNBC.